Thank you. Good afternoon. We must pray for the Pope and for Catholic bishops in Britain and elsewhere, including Ireland, of course. Catholic pastors in Britain and in many parts of the world, including in Rome, are supporting programs of relationships education and sex education in educational institutions which constitute child abuse, involving immeasurably greater numbers than the cases of clerical sex abuse currently afflicting the Church. During a flight to Rome from Panama last month, Pope Francis told reporters that bishops did not know what to do about the clerical sex abuse scandal. He said, "We felt the responsibility to give catechesis on this problem to the bishops' conferences." Significantly, the Pope then said, "I believe that we must provide sex education in schools." Pope Francis went on to mention parents in connection with sex education, but in a somewhat negative way. The Pope said, "The ideal is to begin at home with the parents." But he added, "This is not always possible." He said, "The school makes up for this," adding that if sex education is not provided, he said, the void will be filled by any ideology. Now, the first thing to say about these words of Pope Francis is that they contrast sharply with the teaching of previous popes. Pope Leo XIII taught in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, and I quote, "The contention that the civil government should at its option intrude into and exercise intimate control over the family and the household is a great and pernicious error. Paternal authority can be neither abolished nor absorbed by the state, for it has the same source as human life itself." And Pope Pius XI taught in his encyclical Divini Ilius Magistri, and I quote, "Far too common is the error of those who with dangerous assurance and under an ugly term propagate a so-called sex education, falsely imagining that they can forearm youths against the dangers of sensuality by means purely natural, such as a foolhardy initiation and precautionary instruction for all indiscriminately, even in public." Which pope is right? Is Pope Francis right when he says, I believe that we must provide sex education in schools in order to make up for parents who can't do it? Is he right that the school makes up for this, otherwise the void will be filled with any ideology? Allow me to reflect on those questions. Pope Francis' statement ignores the fact that both Catholic and non-Catholic schools are currently communicating to children through their sex education programs the ideology of the state and the ideology of the international pro-abortion lobby and the homosexual lobby on matters relating to human sexuality. And both Catholic and non-Catholic schools are currently responsible for communicating images or ideas which represent psychological and spiritual child abuse on a worldwide scale. Teachers in British primary schools, for example, have been trained by Stonewall, a militant homosexual rights group which has a policy that little boys might grow up to marry a man and that little girls must be taught that they might grow up to marry a woman. Training by Stonewall for teachers is also happening in Catholic primary schools with the cooperation of the local Catholic authorities. For example, with the support of Archbishop Peter Smith, the Archbishop of Southwark. And in countless Catholic primary schools in England and Wales, children between the ages of 7 and 9 have been shown the video Living and Growing. The video is a cartoon depicting a naked couple chasing each other around a bed and engaging in sexual intercourse in numerous positions. An adult voiceover explains that sex is fun and makes people happy. A young girl's voiceover exclaims, "Yes, they do look very happy." In these videos and discussions, there is no question of introducing the idea of marriage into the sexual equation. As Antonia Tully put it, the head of the Safe at School campaign run by the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, Living and Growing puts sexual activity on the same plane as any activity that a 7-year-old might normally be involved in. How will children deal with this information? Is it a game, a joke, a worry, a fear? How will this affect your child, she said. Antonia says that the evidence suggests that boys are likely to understand the information as a game or a joke, while girls are likely to become distressed. And the Vatican itself has produced a sex education program which should be carefully studied by Catholic parents. You can find it very easily online. It's called The Meeting Point. A few months after the promulgation of Amoris Laetitia, an apostolic exhortation in which Pope Francis called for sex education in educational institutions, in a chapter where he made no reference whatsoever to parents, the Pontifical Council for the Family published a sex education program called The Meeting Point at the World Youth Day in Poland in July 2016. This program, which is intended to be taught in schools in mixed classrooms, adopts a secularized and secularizing approach and exposes children to obscene and pornographic images. Serious questions about the program have been raised by Dr. Rick Fitzgibbons, a psychiatrist and adjunct professor of the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America. He writes, and I quote, "In my professional opinion, the most dangerous threat to Catholic youth that I have seen over the past 40 years is the Vatican's new sexual education program, The Meeting Point, course of effective sexual education for young people." He continues, "In a culture in which youth are bombarded by pornography, I was particularly shocked by the images contained in this new sex education program, some of which are clearly pornographic. My immediate professional reaction was that this obscene or pornographic approach abuses youth psychologically and spiritually." He continued, "Youth are also harmed by the failure to warn them of the long-term dangers of promiscuous behaviours and contraceptive use. As a professional who has treated both priest perpetrators and the victims of the abuse crisis in the church," he wrote, "what I found particularly troubling was that the pornographic images in this program are similar to those used by adult sexual predators of adolescents." The Catholic Education Service, a department of the Catholic Bishop Conference of England and Wales, are even more advanced in promoting an approach to sex education which reflects the ideology and policies of the pro-abortion lobby, the homosexual lobby, and the British government, and which constitutes the sexual abuse of children. From 1999 until 2008, the chairman of the Catholic Education Service was Archbishop Vincent Nichols of Birmingham, now Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. Under his chairmanship, the Catholic Education Service developed a policy which resulted in providing children in Catholic schools, including adolescents under the legal age of consent, with access to abortion and contraception services without parental knowledge or consent through a state-run confidential advice agency named Connections. In April 2010, the Catholic Education Service, now under the chairmanship of Malcolm McMahon, then Bishop of Nottingham, now Archbishop of Liverpool, appointed as Deputy Director Greg Pope, a former Labour Member of Parliament who had an extensive anti-life, anti-family voting record. Greg Pope remained in that post until his promotion in 2017 to be the Assistant General Secretary of the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. In March 2017, the British government passed the Children and Social Work Act 2017, which made the new subjects of relationships education compulsory in all primary schools and relationships and sex education compulsory in all secondary schools, including faith and independent schools. It was announced that the required content of these new subjects would be subject to public consultation, although from the outset, government ministers, including the Prime Minister, stated that relationships education would be LGBT inclusive. And for those of you who still don't know what LGBT means, the letters stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender. The government stated that parents would be able to withdraw their children only from the sex education part of relationships and sex education at secondary school. Archbishop Malcolm McMahon, chairman of the Catholic Education Service for England and Wales, immediately issued a statement welcoming the government's announcement that it was acting to change the law. He said, "We welcome the government's commitment to improving relationship and sex education in all schools. Catholic schools already teach age-appropriate relationships and sex education in both primary and secondary schools." And he continued, "We additionally welcome the government's commitment to protect parental right of withdrawal and involve parents in all stages of the development and delivery of relationships and sex education in all schools. It is essential," he said, "that parents fully support the school's approach to these sensitive matters." Now, despite the apparently strong statement with regard to parental involvement, it's clear that Archbishop McMahon's statement conforms not to established Catholic teaching on sex education, but to the new secular orthodoxy and government policy regarding this area of a child's learning. According to the Archbishop in his statement, it's now the mission of the school to educate the whole person, rather than this being principally the parent's mission and responsibility. The parent is simply granted an involvement in the process because it is essential that parents fully support the school's approach. There is no reference in the Archbishop's statement to the fact that the right of withdrawal at this time was only for the sex education part of relationships and sex education, and that the government's actual distinction between sex education and relationships education is most unclear. In July 2018, the government issued its draft guidance and regulations regarding the proposed content and delivery of the new subjects, and simultaneously launched a second public consultation on their acceptability. Overall, the government's draft regulations and guidance seriously undermine parental rights and present a completely secular view of
human sexuality, marriage and the family, which is seriously contrary to what the Catholic faith teaches. The government's guidance makes it clear that the children's programme of study is expected to be LGBT inclusive throughout and to present homosexual relationships and family structures in a positive manner. In primary school, children must be made to understand and accept that families, quote, sometimes look different from their family, and that they should respect those differences and know that other children's families are characterised by love and care for them. And children must be taught that marriage, including same-sex marriage and civil partnerships, represent a formal and legalised, recognised commitment of two people to each other, which is intended to be lifelong. In other words, primary school children will have to demonstrate respect for the idea and practice of homosexual relationships, and not just for the people involved in them, and will be expected to agree that such relationships, including when they have children, are just as valid, positive and beneficial as those based on real marriage. In relationships and sex education at secondary school, teenagers will be further encouraged to explore their developing sexual orientation and gender identity. Dangerous and immoral lifestyles are to be presented as equally valid as marriage. Abortion is presented simply as one of the available options during pregnancy, and pupils will be signposted to contraceptive and abortion services without any parental knowledge or consent. The right of parents to withdraw their children from the sex education parts of relationships and sex education, which the government had promised to retain, has now been removed and replaced only by a right to request withdrawal, with the final decision going to the head teacher. Even this much compromised parental right is withdrawn altogether when the child reaches 15, when the child will be allowed to overrule their parents as well as the head teacher's wishes if they choose, as children are being given the right to have sex education provided to them by the school. Following the publication in July 2018 of this appalling draft regulations and guidance, the Catholic Education Service issued another press release, again stating that the Catholic Church welcomes the government moves to improve relationships and sex education, as well as how the government had used the Catholic model curriculum as examples of best practice. The Catholic Education Service also welcomes how, and I quote, the recommendations are clear that the right for parents' right of withdrawal will be maintained, even though the draft regulations only allow the parents the right to request withdrawal, which the head teacher will have the right to refuse. The Catholic Education Service also welcomed that schools with a religious character will be able to deliver relationships and sex education within the tenets, that's what they wrote, they meant tenets of their own faith. However, the Children and Social Work Act, as well as the draft regulations, only stipulate that the education is appropriate having regard to the age and the religious background of the pupils, which is open to interpretation and a much weaker requirement than such teaching needing to be in line with the tenets of a particular faith. It's just going to have regard for them. Ofsted inspections have interpreted that to mean a school must clearly teach about homosexuality and transgenderism in a positive light, so that children who may identify themselves by one of the these protected characteristics, as they're called, do not feel marginalised or discriminated against, and that children are adequately prepared for life in modern Britain. A further consultation, July to November 2018, was announced, again regarding the draft regulations and guidance for the new subjects. However, rather than initiating a campaign to encourage Catholics and others who attend Catholic schools to participate in this consultation so that the protection for parents could be genuinely safeguarded and restored, the Catholic Education Service instead maintained its public relations campaign in support of government policy, telling the public that the government's proposals were to be welcomed, that there was nothing to worry about, the Catholic schools already do a fantastic job teaching relationships and sex education, and falsely that the government is committed both to allowing faith schools flexibility to teach according to the tenets of their faith and protecting the parents' right of withdrawal. The Catholic Education Service, on behalf of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, proclaims its confidence that authentic Catholic relationships and sex education will continue to be taught in Catholic schools even after 2020. However, it's far from clear, judging by some of the recent publications of the Catholic Education Service, that it either understands or believes in the perennial teachings of the Catholic Church on the truth and meaning of human sexuality. A guide for Catholic educators, published by the Bishops of England and Wales in 2017, entitled Learning to Love, offers the following description of homosexual relationships. It states, "Here we would like to emphasize that this exalted form of love exists just as powerfully in relationships between people of the same sex as it does in heterosexual relationships. We applaud the great progress that has been made in countering all forms of discrimination against homosexuality in recent times and wish to collaborate with efforts to make such discrimination obsolete." That's on page 17, Learning to Love, if anybody wants to look it up on the internet. Note that we are now talking about discrimination against homosexuality as something that should be countered, as opposed to unjust discrimination against homosexual persons, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches in number 2358. Homosexuality itself has now been transformed from an inclination which is objectively disordered, according to the Catechism, to what can be an exalted form of love, according to the Bishops of England and Wales. And what does it mean to collaborate with efforts to make such discrimination obsolete, to actively promote LGBT and the Pride agenda, to shut down freedom of speech on the issue and persecute Christians and others who try to speak the truth about homosexuality? An even more pernicious document is a document called Made in God's Image, Challenging Homophobic and Biphobic Bullying in Catholic Schools, a joint publication by the Catholic Education Service on behalf of the Bishops of England and Wales and St Mary's University, Twickenham, first published in 2017 and which has been given a second edition without any major alterations, despite its deep and scandalous conflicts with the Church's teaching, which is being widely pointed out by commentators. Under the guise of guidance for the pastoral care of pupils, Made in God's Image is designed to intimidate Catholic schools into introducing a concerted LGBT indoctrination program for children in the form of an 8-lesson scheme of work. An example from the introduction illustrates the strategy being taken, and I quote, "The Church teaches that homosexual persons must be accepted with respect, compassion and sensitivity." Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2358. The school should be mindful that the Church teaches that homosexual inclinations are not sinful. For older pupils who may publicly identify themselves as such, church schools should be havens of respect and custodians of the true dignity of each human being. They should be as attentive to the possibility of homosexual pupils being marginalised and bullied as they are to discrimination based on religion, gender, race or disability. Now, although the Church does indeed teach that involuntarily experiencing same-sex attraction is not itself a sin, the Catechism also adds that the inclination itself is objectively disordered, and that authoritative Catholic teaching has, and I quote, always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered, basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has instructed bishops that although the particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, it is more or less a strong tendency towards an intrinsic moral evil, and thus the inclination itself must be seen as an objective disorder. There's no mention of this in the document, or indeed any mention whatsoever of Catholic doctrine on marriage, or any attempt to present the true meaning and purpose of human sexuality between man and woman. Indeed, the only thing presented as sinful, although it doesn't directly employ the term sin, is the new sin of homophobia, which should have no place among Catholics. Catholic teaching, they say, is on homosexuality is not founded on and can never be used to justify homophobic attitudes. Chillingly, Made in God's Image, published by the Catholic Bishops of England and Wales and St Mary's University in Twickenham, even offers lesson material which encourages children to judge and challenge their own parents and families' attitudes, based on provided examples of expressions of homophobia, including typical comments made whilst watching television programs. It is ironic that a document purported to be concerned with anti-bullying engages in a highly pernicious form of bullying against faithful Catholic children and their parents by labelling them homophobes and bigots. The Scottish Government has so far gone the furthest in Britain along this trajectory, having proudly announced that recently that Scotland will become the first country in the world to have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex inclusive education embedded in the whole curriculum, not just in relationships and sex education. Naturally, if ideological indoctrination is to be truly effective, then thought must be controlled at all times and not just within the confines of certain lessons. Unbelievably, this development was also welcomed by Scottish bishops, who added that they hope the impact of these recommendations will be positive for all. What do Catholic parents do when popes disagree on sex education? Parents, we grandparents, we great-grandparents, must reflect on Catholic doctrine, on faith and morals,
as revealed in the Scriptures, particularly in the Gospel, and as revealed by sacred tradition, that is, the teaching of the apostles, as transmitted faithfully from one generation to the next, at times infallibly from the time of Christ. What a blessing it is for parents then to hear the words of Christ in St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I confess to thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and the prudent, and hast revealed them to little ones. That's who we are. Yea, Father, for so hath it seemed good in thy sight. Parents today are not for the most part theological scholars, and they never have been since the time of Christ. However, countless unlearned but faithful Catholic parents both know and can confidently affirm, without fear of being contradicted in this world or the next, that God's commandment, honour thy father and mother, reaffirmed by God the Son during his life on earth, establishes for all time that parents are the primary educators and protectors of their children. Faithful, unlearned Catholic parents are also fully capable of understanding Christ's words concerning giving scandal to children. And I quote, He that shall scandalize one of these little ones that believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone should be hanged about his neck and that he should be drowned in the depth of the sea. Catholic parents know, but must be reminded, that these words provide a terrible warning to those, including Catholic bishops, who allow the showing of pornographic images in the classroom to children young and old, and who encourage false ideas about human sexuality, including homosexuality, to be taught in the classroom. Catholic parents have a moral obligation to resist Pope Francis's dangerous teaching on sex education. It will add fuel to the raging fire of child sex abuse. Parents must say loud and clear to Pope Francis and to Catholic bishops in Britain, and if necessary to the bishops in Ireland. Sex education is not the solution to systematic child abuse and exploitation. Indeed, what the Vatican, the bishops of England and Wales, and many other bishops around the world are promoting is child abuse in the name of relationships and sex education, involving immeasurably greater numbers than the scandal of the cases of clerical sex abuse currently afflicting the Church. Thank you.